Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends of the Wilfried Martens Center, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here for today's event on the China EV Challenge, Red Flags and Red Lines with Chinese Electric Vehicle. My name is Peter Hevli, I'm the Policy Director of the Wilfried Martens Center. We are delighted to host you here at the ACE event in Brussels on a topic that has been fiercely debated over the last months and weeks and deserves indeed a timely and critical discussion. In late 2024, the European Union made a decisive movement in introducing higher tariffs on electric vehicles manufactured in the People's Republic of China. The message was quite clear. The EU is beginning to draw lines about one of their core industries. However, it's not just about industrial resilience or fair playing field, it's also about digital sovereignty. But 6 months later, can we really speak of a coherent and strategic response across Europe? The case of EV is a typical case, and it's a kind of dilemma we are facing in our double transition of digital and green. Well, on one hand, of course, we have been very much committed to climate change and reduction of emissions. And this comes along with a massive shift into electrification. And of course, the Chinese vehicles can contribute to this purpose. But of course, there are other questions behind. This is an issue of economic overdependence, data access, foreign-controlled cloud services. And all of these topics remained largely unaddressed. In sum, this challenge and the debate today is not just about trade. It's about European competitiveness, technological autonomy, and market fairness in a dramatically shifting geopolitical landscape. Today, we launch our new Martens Center report on what we call the China Auto Shock. And our analysis addresses a lot of urgent questions, which we will hope to discuss, maybe finding some answers later on. For example, should we, as the EU, consider quantitative limits on Chinese EVs, as some member states have already pointed out? How should we approach, as the European Union, state-subsidized competition that undercuts European producers and threatens hundreds of thousands of jobs? Are our framework for data protection and cybersecurity really up to date if we think about vehicles connected to clouds being based abroad? And what can common European platforms play, pooled research and development, private-public investment? This is an issue which goes way beyond just the EV. It's an issue of a large ecosystem you have to think of. Again, our debate today is not just about regulatory or industrial policy issues. They delve very much at the heart of European perception, how to position itself in the 21st global order. Yes, European electric vehicle is a key pillar of our green transition, but it must also become a pillar of our strategic and economic sovereignty. Well, the choices we are now making are not just shaping this very specific market. It is much about also the kind of union we will be in 10 years' time. So I'm very delighted to welcome our dear panelists. I leave the introduction to my dear colleague, Owen Dreher, who will moderate this session. But let me just name Sam, you're the author of the study. Dimitar is our expert on China and digital and green transformation. Mareike, we have been working together many years on China, so I'm very delighted to have these very nice colleagues with us. So after the presentation of the study, we delve into the panel discussion, and then, of course, it's open to you for questions and answers. And please stay with us after the reception, because this is always an important part of our events to connect, to create our network, and we are very delighted to join you later on outside. With this, I would like to leave my introduction and hand over Owen for your moderation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Peter. So I'll start. I'm Owen, I'm the moderator. We've got 3 excellent speakers. Sam, who wrote the paper, he's Senior Policy Director with the China Strategic Risks Institute. He's a former political advisor in Westminster, and he's a media regular when it comes to dealing with EU-British-Chinese relations. Marieke Olberg, she's a Senior Fellow in the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund based in Berlin. Again, key expertise on China. And as Peter mentioned, Dimitar Lilkov is Senior Research Officer in the Martin Center and our China and Tech expert. I'm going to pass the floor directly over to Sam. I'll give you about 10 or 12 minutes. You can kind of give a broad brush on the paper, and then we'll open it out and we'll go to questions. Sam, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you again to the Martin Center for having me and supporting me writing this paper. I think, the first point to make is, going back over the sort of rationale for why the EU imposed tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles to begin with. And this was alluded to earlier. It is the fact of these unfair state competitive practices. And the Keele University found that between 2019 and 2022, BYD, which is the largest Chinese EV company, received 2.9 billion euros in state subsidies. And last year, China faced 198 trade complaints at the World Trade Organization, and of them, only 21 originated from the EU. So this is a global problem where countries are increasingly concerned about the excess manufacturing capacity coming out of China, the fact that they're dumping heavily subsidized goods in the green technology space in the world and on the world stage, and it's problematic. And I think the EU did impose tariffs, and there's been an active debate, and I'm sure we'll get into a debate later about whether those tariffs were high enough or not, with the highest being around 38, 40%, significantly lower, worth pointing out, than America and Canada. I think America put on 100%, Canada's about 130 on top of what they already had. And we've passed a period of time now where there's a little bit of data to look at what that impact has been. And as the report alludes to, it has slowed down some of the Chinese EV imports coming to Europe. But again, last year, particularly in May and November, we saw a spike where Chinese EV market share was about 11%. But overall, you're looking at 8.3%. Now, to give you a broad sense of what does that mean, well, the EU Commission, when they announced their anti-subsidies investigation into Chinese EVs, they were working on a forecast that by the end of this year, they would have 15% market share in Europe. So they're a little bit behind where they're meant to be, but there's a number of factors as to why. People point to the fact that they didn't have a lot of capacity to actually ship Chinese EVs overseas. They now have those rowboats and capacity. Again, obviously the tariffs may have had some impact, but it's really, complicated, as it were, which is the fun section that I'm calling this part of my remarks. And the reality is that different Chinese EV companies have responded in different ways, depending on how much of their profits comes from exports. So Chery Automobile, for example, and Great Wall Motor, about a third of their profits come from exports. So they're very impacted by this. But they're two separate companies. They've taken two different approaches, right? So Chery Auto has decided that they're going to set up a factory in Spain, and they're working with the Spanish government, while Great Wall Motor, based in Berlin, originally has closed its offices and fired its staff and has decided that it won't have a presence in Europe. BYD, again, exporting only makes 10% of their profits last year. So for them, they're less affected. And it's also worth looking, to the countries themselves that have imposed tariffs. They've been doing it from different positions to begin with. So for the Americans, Chinese EVs only made up about 2% of their auto market to begin with. So they were starting from a really low point anyway. So when they put huge tariffs on Chinese EVs, it didn't really bother them. While Turkey had the opposite problem, where they had no tariffs for a while. Chinese EVs took a huge chunk of the market. They've now put 50% tariffs on Chinese EVs. And again, it's had different impacts. So for Chery, that was in Turkey for a long time, they've actually seen the number of EVs completely drop off. While for BYD, they've increased their EVs by over 1,000%. So again, it depends on the company we're talking about. But The broader problem that European automakers is facing is that their profit model no longer makes sense because it's based entirely on having a huge slice of the Chinese automotive market, which they no longer have. Foreign autos in China in 2019 was 60% of the market. In 2024, that's down to 34%. They also, used to obviously having no competition here in Europe, but they're also being outcompeted now by Chinese EV companies in third markets. So BYD, Chery Auto, they're already in Brazil, Indonesia, Thailand. So they're already facilitating these markets before VW can even get its trousers on and get out the door. So that's a huge problem. And we're already seeing the kind of job losses that are to be anticipated. So last year, there were about 100,000 job losses announced by European automakers across Europe. And this is a problem, particularly if you take, say, as an example, Lower Saxony, where VW is from, it's where it's founded. The dividends that the Lower Saxony government gets from their shares in VW accounts to nearly 1% of their state budget. So if, as was being debated last year, VW decides to close down a lot of its operation in Lower Saxony in favor of expanding or keeping its footprint in China, or trying to expand its footprint in the US because of Trump's tariffs, the government of Lower Saxony faces a triple whammy. So they'll lose the taxes that the auto workers are paying, they'll lose the taxes that VW is paying in terms of corporate taxes, and then also their dividend payments may go down. So that's a big problem if you're sat in Lower Saxony today trying to figure out the future of the auto industry. And it's worth pointing out, as I mentioned previously, that some automakers are already setting up shop in Europe in what I would argue is a race to the bottom. So you have Chery Auto in Spain, you've got BYD in Hungary, and if you look at the estimates that both companies have put out, BYD thinks that they can produce 300,000 EVs in Hungary when their plant's up and running. Chery Motor thinks they can get another 150,000 EVs out of Spain. That would be bigger than the amount of EVs that VW produced last year. And that's only out of 2 plants, basically, being operated in Hungary and Spain, which sums up, again, the problem of the current argument about letting them set up shop here in Europe. And the real issue for European automakers is not that Chinese EVs will get 50% of the market here, or even 30%. It's that all they really need is about 15, 20% on top of third markets and squeezing them out of China. And the business model for a lot of these companies no longer makes sense. And if you're in a major city, you also would have noticed BYD showrooms just popping up everywhere. I'm based in London. I see it all the time. I looked up the figures. They've got a Google map. You can go on their website if you're really interested. And there's 59 BYD showrooms now in France. There's 29 in Italy. They're really putting their tanks, as it were, the proverbial tanks on European automakers' lawn, and clearly unfazed from the tariffs. But a broader trend that we're seeing, which is in the report, is also that they're setting up shop in the broader European neighborhood. So Chinese automakers setting up EV battery plants in Morocco. There's talk of them setting up factories in the UK. They've set up some factories in Turkey. So Europe has a broader problem as well, which is that they're also losing sales in their neighborhood, and that includes in Russia. So because of Russia's aggressive war in Ukraine, European automakers left that market, and Chinese automakers have stepped in and they've made record profits. So in the case of Chery Auto, they're now the #1 largest foreign company paying taxes in Russia. So they've made huge profits. And what are they doing with those profits? They're taking those profits and they're investing in factories in Europe. And so that is a problem. And then outside of the economic risk, which, as I've discussed, is essentially deindustrialization, job losses, the next problem is data security. The former head of MI6 talked about electric vehicles not being sort of cars in the most traditional sense, but actually computers on wheels. There's so much data and information that they're collecting, sensors, cameras on the car, and it's a problem. We know it's a problem because there have been leaks in the past. Tesla engineers watching customers when their cars are stationary in their garages. We know that there have been studies showing that Western automakers regularly lost or had their data of users hacked. And China itself has been very worried about this. This is why a couple of years ago they banned Tesla from operating in a number of Chinese cities. And they only lifted that ban when Tesla agreed to partner with Chinese technology firm Baidu and integrate their software into their platform. And so that is a problem. But more broadly, and Mareike will call me up on this later as being a bit of a hack to the problem, Chinese companies have to follow the PRC's National Intelligence Law, which essentially says that they have to work hand in glove with the Ministry of State Security. They have to share what data that they have. And more importantly, they're legally compelled that they can't declare the extent of this collaboration to a foreign entity. So if the EU or a European government was to say, we'd like to know the extent of your collaboration, they wouldn't be able to declare that. And so that's just a huge problem. And more broadly, it's not like this is something that Europe isn't already dealing with other companies. A number of European member states fined Uber recently for transferring drivers' data to the US. So there are other companies already getting around GDPR itself. Now, I'd like to use what's remaining of my remarks before I get onto my recommendations, just to briefly talk about joint ventures, which we're talking a lot about at the moment. It's the idea that what Europe really needs to do is convince Chinese automakers to move to Europe, to set up shop, and to essentially hand European automakers EV battery technology. And that this is, one, both a credible thing that could happen and something that would be good as well. And the reality is I'm quite skeptical, believe it or not, of this proposal. I don't think it will work. If you look at the way the Chinese government behaves in China, the way foreign companies have to operate in China, under the foreign trade law, if you set up shop in China, you're required to file business secrets and sensitive documents with your local government in China. The foreign joint venture rules in China until recently required foreign companies to enter into unequal partners with Chinese companies and transfer technology. And the US Chamber of Commerce still says that a number of their own companies are struggling to get back IP and struggling to take over joint ventures despite these joint venture rules changing. I like to quote Kenneth Wilcox, who is the former head of Silicon Valley Bank in Shanghai. He's an American, and he wrote a book, and he said that when China talks about win-win partnerships, what they mean is that the local partner wins twice. And I think that sums up the problem that a lot of European automakers have struggled with in China. And there are examples of Chinese companies investing in electric vehicle projects, particularly in Sweden, where they've been asked by the Swedish government whether they would introduce local ownership requirements, local supply chain requirements. And those companies, rather than complying with that, have elected to cancel those projects and pull out. And so I imagine that a similar problem would happen with electric vehicles and any investment that you'd be hoping to have. Now, of course, the irony is that at the same time that we're hoping that China might be friendly to us and offer us EV battery technology, we continue to offer them aerospace technology, support in civil nuclear, and support in pharmaceuticals, in unequal joint ventures. And we wonder what will happen in the future to our lead in all of these strategic sectors. Now, of course, I don't think it's fair necessarily to blame China for a lot of the issues that we face today in the auto sector. The reality is that European automakers wasted a lot of time on diesel. They defrauded the public with some of the claims that they made. The Americans had battery technology years ago with the company A123. They didn't commercialize it when they had the chance. And TDK, a Japanese chemical company, set up CATL, which is the largest Chinese EV battery manufacturer. So again, Japan had access to this. And so we really fumbled the opportunity that we had to get ahead of this issue. But it's worth pointing out that China isn't the only game in town, as they like to pretend. There are Korean and Japanese battery manufacturers that produce pretty reasonable EV batteries. They may not be as competitive as CATL or BYD, but they would work. And that's why one of the key recommendations of this report is that the EU should become more ambitious with its partnership with Japan and Korea and work really to create partnerships between Japanese and Korean battery producers and European automakers. A second point and recommendation I would highlight is I think Europe needs to take the same approach to Chinese EVs as they did with Korean and Japanese automakers back in the 80s, which is that they should cap the market share that Chinese EVs can have here in Europe to 10%, which is perfectly reasonable. It's been done before. As I say, there's a context for it. The second thing I think that's worth looking at is overhauling joint venture rules. I think if Europe is serious about keeping its auto supply chain in Europe, then it needs to insist when China is setting up projects here that the supply chain stays in Europe, that ownership is shared or majority stake is given to European owners. When it comes to data security, Europe needs to move swiftly towards developing its own sovereign cloud storage capabilities and insisting that EVs from foreign countries operating in Europe store their data on a trusted cloud provider. From a hardware standpoint, they should be using trusted cellular internet modules, SIMs that go within them. And there's still a leading European company that does that, so it'd be very easy to suggest that as well. And I think more broadly, Europe needs to think carefully about the strategic sectors that it has today, where it still has a lead in, where they are participating in joint ventures in China, whether they want to leverage these relationships or not, or whether they need to take further measures to protect leadership in aerospace and pharmaceuticals, or whether in 15, 20 years' time, I may unfortunately be sat here with you doing the same presentation, just about a different sector. But I'm happy to stop there, and I'm obviously keen for the discussion.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Sam. That's very comprehensive. I'm leaving on vacation next week, so I'm going to try and keep it positive. But after listening to you for 10 minutes, that's going to be, I think, a bit more difficult. What is interesting for people who don't appreciate it is that I think the Belgium automotive market is the ideal place to talk about this, because due to let's call it the complexities of the Belgian tax system, about 50 to 60% of all cars in Belgium are company cars. And they were incentivized, I think, by the previous Belgian government to go electric, low emission. So we have a very high penetration of EVs, plug-in hybrids on Belgian roads. And what's interesting is, as everybody will attest, is that, you know, the Chinese brands are becoming more apparent on the streets. And in fact, you know, with the sales of Tesla declining so rapidly in Western Europe, including in Belgium, I think they will become even more evident in the future. So just before I come to Marieka, just to give her response, would I be right, Sam, in thinking that really, you know, I'm old enough to remember David Cameron and George Osborne and their love bombing of China, you know, in the early 2010s, when China was going to build everything from nuclear and basically save Britain. We had Germany and France trying to bounce the rest of the EU into an investment partnership with China just before the pandemic. People have kind of forgotten that, but that came very close to coming apart. So my question is, on EVs, you know, will the EU be able to cobble together the political coherence? Or are we going to kind of have some sort of halfway house, which is like the 5G issue, which is like, yeah, we're going to strip it out of core, you know, the core network, but it'll be in 2030, it'll be in, you know, is it going to be a situation which delivers nothing really? We'll get a 15 or 20% Chinese EV share in Europe, and we'll get this hodgepodge of European responses.
Yeah, I mean, you told me I should try and be optimistic, right?
I guess so.
I think the comparison with telecommunications is interesting, right? Because, you know, all right, European member states are dragging their heels on stripping out Huawei. And obviously you had the story over the weekend with Spain saying that they can let Huawei, you know, offer services for judicial wiretaps, which makes no sense. You can't strip out electric vehicles from your city, right? They drive around. What are you going to do? Put them in a big sort of impound them or something. It's not going to work, right? Yeah. So I feel like the problem is the issue's moving so fast, right? And tariffs only slow down the issue to a degree. Yeah. But you need a broader industrial strategy, and you need the European automakers to work together. And the reality is they're not willing to do that. They're just doubling down on the same tired old model because fundamentally they don't see themselves as European automakers anymore. They'll say our shareholders are everywhere. And we have as many manufacturing jobs in China now as we do in Europe, maybe even more. So why should we care what Belgium cares, what Belgium thinks or the EU thinks? And that's a problem. It's a big problem. And I would like to think that Europe could get its act together on this. I think the Commission is serious. Looking forward to seeing what happens next week, the EU-China summit. I'm sure this will be a topic amongst all of us. But this is the big debate is who has the competency for European security, right? Is it going to be the Commission driving this thing forward and the member states dragging their heels? Or are the member states going to push back and say, no, it's up to, we can do what we want? And at some point, there has to be a conversation where you might make decisions because you say it's about your economy and your infrastructure, but the whole of Europe is impacted, and that can't be acceptable, right, for all Europeans.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Marieke, your thoughts on you know, how this might play out and what the Chinese thinking is?
Sure. So first of all, thanks so much for inviting me here. I'm going to use my couple of minutes to do maybe three things. The first one is I'm going to join Sam in bashing the automotive industry, because I'm German, so I'm obliged to do this, and I've been screaming about this for years. The second thing I'm going to try to do is put a little bit of a larger, zoom out a little bit into a bird's eye perspective to place this issue that we've been talking about with EVs into a broader context. And basically, the bad news is I don't think we're going to come out of this more optimistic. And then since you did say I was going to call you out, which I wasn't, but you said it, so now I have to, and now I will. So that's going to be my final point, which I do think will drive home a larger point that we need to take into account, and that I know you're aware of. So the first on the automotive industry, as Sam has already pointed out, this is not something where the automotive industry is blameless and the mean Chinese have come in with all their subsidies. I mean, there are a lot of subsidies, but a lot of the mess that European automotive, a lot of which is German automotive, is in is of their own making because of decisions that were taken years ago that were wrong, delaying certain things, not investing in new technologies, sticking with old models. And for a couple of years now, I think automotive industry, at least the German car makers, have been quite aware that their future is limited. And they've kind of been waiting for this moment that has now come where basically they're going to get overtaken, they're going to have fewer sales in China, which was always, you know, it's like, before we go under, we're going to make a couple more years of profits by selling lots of cars in China, and basically the moment that they've been dreading has come a little sooner now, and now everybody's shrieking about the job losses. But if I want to be really mean, I would say it's incredibly cynical because people have been aware of this moment coming for several years. I've been talking about it since I think at least 2018, 2019. Yeah. So people are plenty aware, including inside the automotive industry. So the thing here is this is not just the story of China, but also about our own problems and our own mistakes that we made here. Second point, around zooming a little out and giving a little bit of a bird's eye perspective. And that's unfortunately why I think we are in quite a bit of trouble. I think first off, we need to understand that EVs to the Chinese government are not just cars. They're not just something that's like, oh, it would be lovely and nice if we could export those cars to Europe. Basically, the entire economic strategy of the Chinese government currently is built around being able to export cars. EVs are part of the three new, so it's like you have solar, you have ion lithium batteries, and you have EVs. Those are the three new technologies that are supposed to be the new drivers of the Chinese economy. So the idea is, as you know, real estate goes under as a driving force in the Chinese economy. There's been like a long, slow brewing real estate crisis in China, as there is trouble in other sectors, as China, just like many other countries, faces massive unemployment. Those technologies are supposed to save the Chinese economy. The European market is one of two big markets where China can sell its cars. The other big market is, of course, the Chinese market, right? So with the US already closed off and other markets, there are some other markets where China can sell some of its EVs, but just as the biggest consolidated market, the European Union is the one that they want to have. So any restrictions that are put on Chinese vehicles here, any tariffs have been met with a very, very hostile response from the Chinese government. And that is, of course, because they have built the economic growth strategy on the export. And that essentially makes it vital to continue. It's basically, it becomes a regime security issue. If the economy goes under, if there's mass employment, China's going to have a huge problem. We got to prevent that at all costs. And that's why on anything that we do that pertains to these new economic growth drivers in China, we can expect very, very fierce pushback simply because it's a matter of the economy keeping going, keeping the lights on in China as well. Second point that I want to make in this regard is this does, of course, go beyond our dependencies in renewables, in clean tech, green energy, goes way beyond just EVs. I think in one of the, I don't think it's in this particular publication, but in one of your previous related publications, you had a nice little table that listed out not just, of course, our EV dependencies, but the supply chain behind it. And it went from, you had the minerals, the critical minerals that go into the batteries, the battery manufacturing itself, some other steps, and then the final product. And essentially in all of those steps, we are highly dependent on China. When it comes to critical minerals, those are currently in the news because of rare earth elements that China has been restricting as part of the trade war with the United States, where Europe kind of got hit, where we found out that, on those, we are highly dependent on China. We're not going to be able to get them. That's one thing. Then there's, of course, the battery manufacturing itself and our dependencies in various other technologies that are related to the green energy transition in Europe, right? So this is not just a question of can we figure out how to handle EVs, but it's a question of how can we figure out critical dependencies on China in various other sectors. Can we do it? The third point here is, I think anything that we do in order to come up with this is gonna involve very thorough thinking, looking at our supply chains, looking at our critical dependencies on China and figuring out, okay, where do we have dependencies that to us are acceptable, where the risks are acceptable. If something were to go wrong, we could either make up for it, or we don't think we're crucially dependent on China, we can handle it. And where do we know that if something were to go wrong, China would have instruments to very seriously harm us, and then basically act accordingly and commit to reducing those dependencies. That is not an easy thing to do. We have an example, for instance, from Japan that has been trying to reduce its dependency on China for rare earth elements, because in 2010, China said no more rare earths for you, Japan. They managed to bring down their dependency on China from roughly 90% to roughly 60%. Incredibly hard to do. But Japan was also, for the most part, kind of on its own because it was ahead of the curve because it had this case. So the question is, if we have those critical dependencies, can we really fundamentally commit to reducing them? I think there's a number of suggestions that go in the direction of how to do it. It can't just be tariffs. It would have to really invest in our own industries in a very serious way, work with the partners that we still have to come up with those alternatives. But we really have to commit to it, and we're gonna have to have very solid industrial policy because the market's not gonna cut it on this one. And last point, and this is the point that I like to make, is whatever we do, when we assess our own dependency on China and the risks that come with it, we have to look at that we can't just completely project our own model on the other side, because we tend to talk about the state in China, and we talk about the companies, and some people have caught on to the fact that private companies might not be quite as private. But one example that I like to take here that I think Europeans need to understand is the laws that Sam cited earlier, was like Chinese citizens or Chinese companies are obliged to help the security state in China provide information. And one of the points I'd like to make there is it didn't need the laws to be able to compel people and companies, and that includes, I guess, Western companies that are operating in China, to cooperate with them. Basically, the law in a way, codified existing practice. And in a way, that was good, because now I have a piece of paper that I can point to and say, look, the law requires them to cooperate, right? But it doesn't necessarily, it didn't need the law for them to be able to do this. And I think this is just one other thing that we need to understand, because companies come to me and are like, well, if my Chinese side, if they give me a piece of paper with a pinky promise that they're not going to take the data out of Europe, can I rely on that? And I'm like, well, no. So it's an understanding that we still have to make here in Europe, come to here in Europe. So I want to close with that. Whatever we do, we really need to commit to the strategy that we come up with. That can be a strategy that I'll personally disagree with, but we're gonna have to do it, and we're gonna have to then stick with it. And it has to be done with a fundamental understanding of the competition and the other side that we're up against.
Okay, thank you. I was just thinking, it's fascinating because EVs, in a way, they crystallize so many different strands. We can't just talk about, one sector. So it's like economic security, supply chains, trade, industrial policy, environmental policy, technology, data, single market, China. It's all interconnected. So my quick follow-up question to you would be, do you think the new German government will be able to develop a more coherent strategy? Because as much as we don't like to admit it in Brussels, where Berlin goes, the EU generally follows.
I mean, that's essentially the key in many, many ways. And this is one of the few bright spots, since you did ask for optimism. And I'm not exactly a fan of the current German government. I was expecting to be vastly disappointed in them. I was expecting very bad things, I have to say, so far. At least when it comes to larger foreign policy issues, when it comes to relations with China, when it comes to relations with the United States, some realism in all of this, I've actually been positively surprised. So we've had a fairly strong statements, both on the relationship between Europe and the United States. There is on China. I think on China, the heart in the new government is in the right place. So it's more a question, it's not a question of the commitment to it, but it's a question of essentially, one, how much lobbying is going to get in between, and are they going to have the right people to come up with the right policy that is actually going to work? But in principle, I'm actually, on this issue, more optimistic than I would have been a couple of months ago.
Okay. Good.
Doesn't mean that we're going to manage. I'm just saying the potential is there and the basics are there. Now It depends on how that's going to be executed.
Okay, understood. Sam, before I come back to you, there's so many different issues. I'm just going to pick a few, but I really want to come back to you in a second about some of the recommendations. But Dimitar, the other issue I really want to consider is, and I think Sam referenced it in his report, is this whole data issue. When Dimitar started in the Martin Center several years ago, he was on to me, oh my God, we need to do something about the Chinese and data, blah, blah, blah. And I was there looking at him. I'm Irish. I said, we send all our data to the Americans, we'll be okay. What are we going to do about this data problem? Because I feel like the EU, it's like plugging holes. It's like a ship, and it's constantly like GDPR, whatever, but more holes keep appearing, and the data keeps.
No, you're right on the money. I call it the data insanity in this case. So the data goes to Beijing. The companies are sharing it. It's a nightmare on privacy. But even if you're not that focused or paranoid about privacy, or they can switch off the vehicle from 1,000 miles, think of it as a commercial advantage also for these companies. Because they are, in a way, better than ours as it stands, but this data dependence and the fact that this will be gated and kept gives them a commercial advantage in the long run. And here, I mean, it's very easy to bash Brussels, but actually Brussels in the last couple of years has been trying to do its job properly. It's the member states which are absolutely sitting on their hands. It was mentioned already, the 5G, huge vulnerability we've been having for years Only a dozen or so member states comply with the toolbox and actually care about sensitive critical infrastructure. But let's look around what's happening around the world. It's not only me being paranoid about this. Look at the Americans. There's been a bipartisan agreement on this. The tariffs came, and they have 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. During the Biden administration, there was already a draft on banning vehicles which can be manipulated through certain means. And I think officially from 27, most likely we'll see an official ban on Chinese EVs and Russian vehicles, by the way, because of these data vulnerabilities and the automated driver capabilities. India decided to stop the penetration of BYD within its borders because of the concerns on national security, because of the fact that Chinese are using rare earths and magnets to manipulate and extort. So all of these big countries are already taking sides and making steps, and we're just sitting on our hands. And let me put it in even more practical terms. What is the point of the GDPR? What is the point of concepts like technological sovereignty if we cannot describe and satisfy our citizens and convince our citizens that we're protecting their interests? The privacy debate got into its own direction in the last couple of years. There's many aspects of it, but again, it boils down to this. Are we protecting our consumers? There's an interesting parallel, by the way, when we talk about standards and Chinese vehicles. 15, 20 years ago, they wanted to penetrate our market when it comes to classic internal combustion engine cars, 15, 20 years ago. Then they were basically stopped at the border. Why? Because they did not comply with our safety standards. The EU had very specific safety standards about cars. They didn't comply with them, so they didn't get access to our market. So in this case, we need to apply the same basic strategy. Standards about data security, about how this data is being kept, cloud storage as one of the recommendations in Sam's report. And if these requirements are not met, we simply cannot allow them to operate within our internal market. Simple as that. Second point about economic security, and again, maybe let's also be honest about the fact that Chinese EVs are good products. I mean, they are cheaper, they have better entertainment capabilities, maybe better navigation in some instances. There's debate about mileage and all of that, but they are good in producing them. The question is that this comes at the expense of, it goes against WTO rules on subsidies, there's slave labor involved in this. Producing a Chinese electric vehicle in China is a huge environmental concern when it comes to emissions and the fact that they have no environmental standards there. And again, this is something which Sam mentioned in the report. When they are doing joint ventures, when they're doing collaborations, they are also putting in Chinese communist spy cadres in these companies. And this is a way, through management perspective, also they're tapping into our markets, and this is becoming also a vulnerability for companies' national security. And all of this is not new. They've been playing the same playbook for more than 20 years when it comes to different aspects. The solar industry has been mentioned. Many people forget that Europe had a huge global stake in solar before 2010. Of course, the market was smaller at the time. I think we had more than 30% stake. Then the Chinese started pumping and dumping, subsidizing. We tried to make some kind of trade retaliation against them, but then Beijing basically said, we're going to tariff your cars and your wine and cheese, and we stopped. And lo and behold, 15 years later, they have cannibalized the whole solar production industry here in Europe. So when it comes to economic security, we have become a dumping ground to Chinese overcapacities. If you look at the structure of the Chinese economy as it stands, they are solely dependent on exports to continue growth. So I think that in this instance, we do have leverage against the Chinese government. The EU summit is coming soon because they are dependent on us as a market. So talking about economic security, tariffs, FDI screening, a market cap on Chinese EVs, all of these are pertinent points that we need to act on. And last point, and here maybe I want to get a bit provocative. Let's see how this is met in the audience. Of course, there's a climate angle in all of this. Because of course there's a push to keep the EU market open for EVs because this helps us achieve certain environmental goals. You know, people in Brussels love electric vehicles. But it's interesting, you know, because in the last 1 or 2 years here in Brussels, I get the sensation that people care more about climate goals than about things like, Maastricht criteria or financial predictability. The obsession with climate goals is leading us to these instances where there needs to be a decision about the trade-offs. And the Green Deal, especially in the design of the Green Deal in the previous mandate, now there's some positive attempts to revamp it. But as it stands, right now, there is no profit in the Green Deal. There's only regulation, only obligations, and we're not even helping the climate. Because when you sit down and you talk with the Chinese about this, they like to advertise about the fact that, they're rolling out renewables, there's lots of EVs, they're investing in this. Yes, absolutely. But look at the numbers. Every year, they're using more coal than previously. Every year, Chinese CO2 emissions are going up because of the fact that the bulk of their economy is still reliant on coal and gas. And when you talk with Chinese planners on this, they don't really care about the environment. First of all, they care about air quality in the coasts of eastern China, where the elites are concentrated. Shanghai, Beijing, Guangdong, Pearl River Delta. They want to make sure that there's good air quality there. Mareike, correct me if I'm wrong. And secondly, they want to improve their energy security, because energy security is a huge vulnerability for the People's Republic of China. And finally, the Chinese love the European Green Deal. They love it because it makes sure that we continue to be their dumping ground for their production. And in a way, we need to be aware of this. And final point, again, I'll be happy to hear thoughts on this, but the EV market is not a one-way street. Right now, there's 50 million, I think, electric vehicles globally, out of 1.2 billion internal combustion engine vehicles. EVs are great. They're making a headway, but they're still a very small percent of the market share globally. I am not convinced that there's going to be no market for internal combustion engine vehicles in the next 10, 20 years. On the contrary, in many, many markets, there's going to be demand for internal combustion engine vehicles, while here in the EU, we decided to kill one of our most competitive industries. So we need to be thinking about this as well. The Japanese, by the way, Toyota, Subaru, Mazda, right now, we discussed this with Owen, they're developing new models for internal combustion engines, which are less impactful for the environment, but they also see that this is going to be a prominent chunk. So to wrap up, here in Brussels, we are wasting a lot of time and political oxygen on discussing some of these climate issues, 2040 climate targets and all that, and at the same time, we're just continuing to pump a lot of wealth to the People's Republic of China. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dimitar. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. Just before I open it to the audience for some questions, Sam and Mareike, I want to ask you one question because Dimitar mentioned specifically Japan. We've been writing in the Martin Center for a long time about the potential, both practically and what we can learn from Japanese and South Korean approaches. And this isn't just it's not just kind of aspirational, because we've seen in the last 3 years that South Korea has become a hugely important military producer to Central and Eastern Europe, and is now building factories in Poland and supplying a huge variety of armaments to Central and Eastern European countries. And Sam, one of the conclusions or recommendations in your paper was, this pursuit of joint ventures with Japanese, South Korean companies. Maybe if you could just expand on that a little bit more. Mareike, I'll come to you then.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the fundamental point I was trying to make in the paper was that, yes, Chinese EV battery producers are rapidly gaining global market share, but the Japanese and the Koreans still hold about a third globally. And yes, it's true that you have BYD developing new batteries that will go a further distance, but companies like Panasonic, for example, still produce very good batteries. And you have a better shot of having a marriage of convenience between a European automaker who wants to try and keep their global market share and a Japanese battery manufacturer wants to keep their global market share, than you will with a Chinese partner who essentially, as Mareike has summed up really well, basically wants it all. Like, they're not interested in giving Europe a quarter of the cake. good luck with that. They want all the cake, basically.
And it's interesting that Japanese and South Korean producers have been also able to keep a huge amount of production, or they've been able to maintain huge market share in the United States. Because all the arguments now from President Trump and stuff about China were in effect the same arguments that the Americans were using against Japanese penetration of the American market in the 1980s. And Sam, one of your other recommendations I think is interesting because it's the approach that President Reagan took to the Japanese car industry in the 1980s, which was to reach an agreement as part of a trade-off on voluntary export limits. And I see that that was also one of your conclusions. I'm just wondering, do you think that's particularly feasible in the current EU climate we have at the moment?
I mean, it may not be feasible, but I think
Yeah.
it's a good starting point for negotiations because
Yeah.
the reality is the tariffs are low. I think they're hit at a point basically where they don't eat into really the profit margins for some of the Chinese EV companies.
Yeah.
So I think the problem is that it's great that the EU got to some sort of a consensus. We can debate what that looked like on even having tariffs, but if they're not effective, then the game is over, right? So if the Commission is saying, if Chinese EVs get 15%, we're in trouble, then something needs to be done now. And I think, it's a reasonable first opening salvo, as it were, in a negotiation between the Commission and Beijing to say, let's limit your market exposure, let's reassess after a year and see where we are. And I think, more broadly, the set of recommendations are there to be practical, right? It's talking about what could be practically done. As Dimitar mentioned in his remarks, if there's nothing to worry about when it comes to data security, put your data on European cloud servers, use European hardware, right? We can be reasonable about it. We can have joint ventures if they're done on the right terms. And then really the ball is in their court.
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember not that long ago, maybe 5 years ago, maybe even less, that, particularly in Europe, Toyota was roundly criticized for focusing so much on hybrid and super small efficient combustion engines because people thought we were all going to be driving EVs by 2030. But the reality is, I think a very good example, Dimitar mentioned some examples, is that Ireland has a very ambitious strategy of and a target of having 1 million EVs on the roads by 2030. And I think we're somewhere at about 114,000. So it's going to be a much longer term process as well, and it's how we manage that change. But Marieke, any final comments, particularly on what we could learn from Japan or South Korea and these Southeast Asian economies in dealing with this kind of issue with China?
I mean, there are many, many examples, I think, where we could learn from some of them. And in some cases, we'd have to be careful because some of the circumstances might not be the same. But I do think one thing is learning from them. The other thing is strategically partnering with those countries to see where we can join hands. The example I want to bring up again, because we're gonna need those, is, I mentioned it earlier, Japan trying to reduce its reliance on China for rare earths. Now, obviously, what Japan has done, bringing it down to 60%, that's not going to cut it. But I do think some valuable lessons have been learned from that. I think one of them is Japan set up processing for rare earths, because one thing is mining, right? You have the supply of critical minerals, and then you have the processing stage, and those are two different things. And for mining, I think Japan worked a lot with Australia. That's of course another ally another partner we can work with. But then for processing, I think Japan primarily worked with Malaysia, and that comes with a lot of challenges, and that takes up a point that Dimitar mentioned, which is essentially around environmental pollution. this kind of stuff is incredibly messy, it's incredibly dirty, and it's been done in China in ways that have polluted large amounts of land, sometimes in small scale workshops where things were processed. I do want to push back a little bit on the point that the Chinese government doesn't care about the environment at all. The point is this, they care when Chinese people care, because ultimately it can also become a pressure point, right? So the more China actually does grow and the more people become aware of these issues, the more pushback there's going to be to make these things better. That, of course, also means if China manages to lock in a monopoly on a lot of these processes and then at some point feels the need to, of course, make things safer, as they should, and to make things less polluting, the price is going to go way up. Right? But at that point, if there's no alternative on the market, we may just have to swallow the price. And this is something that we've priced into a lot of the estimates that we've made, what certain things are going to cost. So once we hit that point, things may actually go up. So that's another important point to consider, because yes, at some point also a lot of people in China are no longer going to want to have cancer villages. People already don't want to have that. But at some point, there's going to be enough pressure to push back. That's a good thing. But again, if there is a monopoly at that point, that does mean that we're going to be dependent on much higher prices at that point.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we've got about 15, 20 minutes. For questions, just put your hand up. I see a Spanish gentleman here and another there, and we'll take those two first.
Well, thank you. Álvaro de la Cruz from FIGIFA, the European Association of Automotive Parts Distributors and the voice of the independent aftermarket. First of all, thank you and congratulations once again. I might be biased, but the Martin Center always does a fantastic job with these reports and events, and I think this is very timely and perfectly on the point. I wanted to ask you whether you have considered one facet of the automotive industry which is extremely important, and if not, to consider expanding this study into that field, which is repair and maintenance. We represent twice as many jobs as the automakers in Europe. We don't delocalize, and we are not losing jobs. On the contrary, we are creating as much as the shortage of talent allows us. And we face daily, with our network of 400,000 independent workshops across Europe, all kinds of manufacturers from all kinds of countries and all kinds of engines, including EVs from China. And one of the things that I want to highlight is that we face critical breaches with not enforcement of European existing regulation on the most basic elements, such as type approval. There's entire models or many components of models coming into the market not fulfilling the type approval regulation in Europe. We suspect some national type approval authorities in specific suspicious countries are not doing their job. I don't want to say more, but that's one of the things I think we need to put our eyes on. Secondly, also the fulfillment of their access to repair and maintenance information, which should be available and free. If you go to not only the small manufacturers from China, but even some of the big ones like BYD to the website, there's absolutely nothing there. And it's been years now. It's not a tiny newcomer. There's absolutely no respect for ICO standards, for the basic information workshops and repairers and catalogs and publishers have to access. And even issues with the availability of spare parts. Because as you know, cars have to be maintained and repaired, and there's a lot of rotation in some spare parts. And with not only the small ones, in which we have even bigger problems, we also monitor usually from Norway, which is the most advanced EV market. And in that case, we have even smaller manufacturers from China that have penetrated the market with huge subsidies, and 3 years later, they're bankrupt. The manufacturer doesn't exist anymore. The insurance company cancels the insurance, and there's no one to go to. But not only these small companies, with big companies, there's no way to access spare parts. There's no equivalent. There's no technical information. So I would just suggest that if you haven't considered this, you go also to enforcement in the life cycle of the vehicle, which is extremely important, especially with now Europeans suffering with purchasing power. And secondly, also when it comes to dependencies, the entire industry has been telling the Commission this winter, when they were drafting their European Industrial Action Plan for the automotive sector, that we need to go and achieve our goals with technological neutrality. And they keep stubborn about only one solution for reaching our goals, which is only lithium-based battery models, which is, by surprise, the model chosen by Volkswagen Group. I don't want to say more, but also if we want to maybe reduce our dependencies, we need to not put all of our eggs in the same basket and consider many more technologies from synthetic fuel to hydrogen and others, and not only focus on EVs powered by lithium batteries. So just keep in mind the aftermarket. We represent many jobs and many elements for mobility in not only urban areas, but in rural areas. And we're willing to cooperate with all manufacturers, but we have real problems that could be easily solved with just enforcement of existing rule.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we have another gentleman down there.
My name is Markus Wohlmuth, External Action Service. Thanks to Martin Center for another great event like this. The title, the China EV Challenge, could actually also be read from another perspective. Because when we following recent media reports and experts, they're being cited that say that China faces huge challenges with the heavily subsidized EV production and economy, as there should be a massive overproduction, huge overcapacity of facilities. They will not be able to sell their cars, being it in China or exporting it, and there should be parallels to the real estate crisis, and there should be a huge amount of zombie enterprises. So first of all, from your point of view, is this right? And if it is, could this be a chance for Europe when negotiating trade agreements with China? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I will, one more. Oh, I see two more. Yeah, we'll take two more here, and then I'll come back to the panel.
Hi, Garvin Walsh from the Martin Center. I wanted to think a bit more broadly about, industry and manufacturing and its relationship to the transition. We've talked about cost of living, we've talked about prices. And what China has been able to do through its subsidies and its disregard for labor standards and all the rest has been to produce at scale extremely quickly. I would like to wonder what our alternative to China for producing at scale extremely quickly is. Because we're not going to achieve the green transition if the result is more expensive cars and more expensive mobility for everyone. People will quite rightly revolt. We're not going to even achieve good living standards for people if the costs of electronics or other things increase. At the same time, the manufacturing share of employment in all developed countries tends to fall. It's been falling. This is a universal rule that happens everywhere. But the manufacturing, and insofar as manufacturing industry exists in the West, it is because of automation, capital-intensive manufacturing, and so forth. Insofar as we make money out of manufacturing, it is also quite clear. I mean, Richard Baldwin's done tons of work on this, that it's the design and the after-sales where the value is really added. So if we are to think about the role of manufacturing expertise and skills in Europe, shouldn't we be thinking about separating those skills that add value from the places where the actual piecing together of physical products is done, and finding other allies apart from China where this piecing together of physical products should be done?
Okay, thank you. And last question.
Thank you. Jakub Malowski from FGS Global Consultancy. Couple of questions to Sam on your main policy recommendation on the 15% market cap. First one is, can you elaborate on how that would be compatible with WTO rules? I mean, we can talk about the international rules-based trading system being broken and all, but there's only so far we can go with constantly criticizing China for not playing by the rules and then completely disregarding them ourselves. And related to that, and Mareike already touched on it, I admittedly only just now glanced at your report, but what I thought was a bit missing or not as prominent as it probably should have been is the whole value chain, so critical materials, rare earths, etc. So suppose that we take up your proposal and implement the 15% market share cap, how would you assess the risk of China adopting such measures that they did with gallium and germanium, for instance, at a whim, and thereby suffocating the EU industry even more than had it been the case otherwise? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Marieke, I might come to you first. Please just pick one or two questions that are of interest to you.
Yeah, so starting with overcapacity issue, perhaps, yes, I think it is correct, roughly speaking, that there are, a lot more is being produced than there's currently a market for, but I'm not sure that that's going to give us a whole lot of leverage. I think the problem with that is it's going to put us under more pressure because there is going to be, like I tried to say earlier, there's huge pressure from the Chinese government to try to make sure that there will be a market for this and to create that market and to push others to create that market. And there's already trouble on the Chinese side on many, many other areas. So it's, if anything, is going to put the European Union under much more pressure and is probably going to lead to China, it's going to make it more likely for China to bring out some of the big guns, which brings me to the second point that you just made. And this is why I'm saying we need to look at the risks, because that is, we are dependent in so many different ways, and we've already seen China throw some of that weight around, which, in some cases, I get that. China has a certain goal, it's going to throw its instruments around, but if we don't reduce our dependencies, in the more holistic way, we're going to be very much reduced in our sovereign decision making, because any decision we can take, there can be retaliation in another area, and until we fought that, a lot of time will have passed, and we will have a big problem. And last, on the bringing, who can produce at scale? It's a huge, complex problem. Things are going to get more expensive. I think that's a fact. But I do think some things cannot be brought back to Europe. Some things don't make sense to bring back to Europe. Even when we're talking about certain processing, we can do that with allies and partners. So the way to go here, as you already indicated, is to find the right allies and partners and actually set up something with them. This is currently, of course, being complicated by the fact that our little global alliance system is falling apart. But I do think we need to look for, they've already been named: Japan, Korea, Australia, and then we can look for countries we can work with on an ad hoc basis on different things. But that's going to be the strategy to go. It's not going to give us the cheapest products, but it is going to give us, perhaps, if we get things right, products that are going to reduce our dependency on an actor that is well known and well willing to throw its weight around.
Yeah. In finance, the first rule of finance is diversification. I think it should be applied to all aspects of life, except your personal life, of course, but that's a personal choice. Sam?
Yeah, the questions that were directed to me, I'm not sure if it would be WTO compliant. To be honest, I'd wager it'd be worth debating whether it's WTO compliant and seeing if China really wants to take the EU to the WTO on it. A lot of what China has done over the last several years is not WTO compliant. I think the EU could find grounds that this is a legitimate recourse, but the alternative to not doing that is essentially doing what Dimitar has suggested, which is that you would have to slow roll the adoption of EVs and, in effect, have a market cap, but it'd be a soft market cap, because you'd be saying we're not going to do EV targets, we're really going to slow roll it, we're going to double down on hybrid, we're going to double down on the combustion engine, and then basically that's kind of giving up on the climate transition, basically. And that might happen anyway, right? Because if all the jobs go, so much of the climate transition is sold on creating the next generation of jobs. And I think if you lose consumers because of cost and also because the jobs aren't in it, then that's a problem. And then on the critical minerals point, I agree with Marieke. Basically, I think what China has done now, the fact that they weren't even aiming at the EU and they hit Europe anyway, so you're telling me they're going to retaliate for something that Europe's doing, but they're already retaliating against Europe for something that America has done. I think the conversation right now that a lot of countries are having is we need an alternative critical mineral supply chain away from China. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. How are we going to get there? Who wants to be involved? Is this going to be a G7 initiative? Are the Americans going to be on board, or is it going to be a G7 without America? Where's going to be the likely source for critical mineral refinement projects? Is it going to be Australia? Is it going to be Canada? Who's paying for it? I think these conversations are ongoing now, and it's inevitable. But your point's right. Like, in the short term, what are we going to do? Like, China has us essentially cornered. But the fundamental point is that there are only so many customers in the world that can buy their car right now at the price point they want. And a large swathe of those customers are sat here in Europe. And if America's market's closed, Canada's market's closed, then if Europe closes its market, that's a big problem for them, as one of the other questioners alluded to, right? Like, economically, they're going to run into trouble. A lot of these car companies in China are very over-leveraged. They're going to consolidate. There's already unemployment rising in the automotive sector in China. So it's a big gamble, and it only pays off if we basically go along with it. And I'm not sure necessarily we will. I think I'd certainly take on board the point about reshoring doesn't economically make a lot of sense right now. So you're probably looking at Indonesia, Vietnam, India, but obviously the regulatory environment in India is a complete nightmare. But maybe there is a world, since robotics is going to become a big thing, where actually it doesn't really matter where you have a physical factory that's putting together the pieces, because you can do that anywhere in the world. And in that world, that's turned on its head, then it doesn't really matter where your factories are based.
Yeah.
But who knows, again, how long that's going to take to get there. And again, we have a similar problem with robotics, where China is potentially about to take the lead ahead of America. And then if they produce all the robots, then that point is moot.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Dimitar, final comments to you?
Yeah, maybe just a minute, couple of points. Sam and Marika are the heavyweights on this, of course, but I'll do my best. Alvaro, thanks for the mention on secondary market repair and maintenance. I think this is a excellent hidden part of the conversation, because lots of spotlight is put on these issues, but something to be concerned of for sure. The gentleman in the back from the European External Action Service, yes, they are, piling up storage spaces with overcapacities when it comes to EVs. But to be honest, this is nothing new. If you look at Chinese industrial strategy and manufacturing in the last couple of decades, ever since reform and opening up, ever since Deng, ever since Jiang Zemin, huge overproduction of TVs, refrigerators from the 80s, 90s economy. They're absolutely used to this. This is priced in. This will continue. This will go on. Interesting fact, by the way, there's a lot of spotlight on EV sales in China. I just want to remind the audience that almost double the number of EVs come out from China when it comes to internal combustion engine vehicles. They are still producing twice the number of internal combustion engines. There's a huge market in Asia for Chinese ICEs, so don't underestimate this. Final point, Garvin, about manufacturing. Absolutely good points that manufacturing jobs are fizzling away. You can make this case for many, many industries, but I think the auto sector is one of our crown jewels. 13, 14 million jobs in the EU, 7% of employment. People recognize European brands. People love luxury European brands. This is something, when we talk about European standing in the world internationally, this is one of our main industries, so it makes sense to be even a bit protectionist about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitar. I want to thank Dimitar, Sam, Marika. Thank you for your comments. I want to thank you all for coming. That marks the end of the event. We'll certainly be working on these issues. We'll continue to work on these issues in the future, and you're more than welcome to join us for lunch outside. Thank you.
Thank you.